Welcome to the Northeast Kingdom Voice. I'm your host, Scott Wheeler. Today's guest has served most of his adult life as the CEO of the NVRH Hospital in St. Johnsbury. Our guest today is Paul Bengtson.
Hello, good morning. Good morning, everybody.
We started out when you first arrived at the station. I said, you know what? I feel like I've known you forever because our worlds has actually swirled around each other, but we've met very seldom. Because I remember years ago, maybe 25 years ago, when I was working with the Chronicle, your name would pop up. I was a reporter there, and then I started covering and writing about the need for dialysis, and you were fighting for a dialysis center at NVRH, and
Right.
North Country was working there, but then
Well, there's a story behind that. I can give you the skinny on that. Basically, what happened when I first got here, after looking at demographics and locations of certain regional services, it was obvious to me, just looking at a map, that there were absolutely no dialysis services on the eastern side of the state. And the law at the time said the only dialysis centers that could exist in the state of Vermont had to be sponsored by the then Medical Center of Vermont, which is now UVM Medical Center. But I originally went to the Medical Center in Burlington and asked them to get involved in starting a dialysis center on the eastern side of the state. I didn't care if it was in St. Johnsbury. I didn't care if it was in Newport. Just as long as it was placed in a location that people could easily access, because I actually knew people and talked to people who told me they were choosing to die because they did not want to travel the way they had to travel for dialysis services. So the short of it was that then Medical Center of Vermont said no, they would not sponsor this. So I said, to heck with this, I'm going over to New Hampshire, because they don't have rules like this. And so I got together with a group of leaders over in New Hampshire, and we started a dialysis center in Lancaster, New Hampshire. And that worked very well for a while, but obviously the need was still there. So after lobbying for the law to be changed, which it was eventually, such that Dartmouth could actually sponsor something, I went to both Dartmouth and UVM to get support for this, starting something in the Northeast Kingdom, because there were 6 dialysis centers on the western side of the state and 0 on the eastern side of the state, meaning the dividing line being the Green Mountains. So the long and short of it was, we actually agreed, we had a memorandum of understanding with North Country Hospital to have an independent study, where's the best place for this to be sited. And the results of that independent study said St. Johnsbury, but politically that didn't go over well with people in the Northeast Kingdom. But through a lot of pushing and shoving, everything worked out for all the people in the Northeast Kingdom. So you got a center in Newport, and you have a center in St. Johnsbury, and that has saved a lot of lives.
right, yeah, because when I was with the Chronicle, I was writing and recording stories of people who had to make those trips. Like, a lot of people who, because I hadn't been exposed really to dialysis, I didn't realize it isn't like other services. This is something you might need for the rest of your life.
Right.
And
or until you can get an organ transplant.
And so there were people leaving the Northeast Kingdom 3 days a week, head down to Burlington, Dartmouth, or elsewhere. And then I ended up being employed by North Country, so I've covered dialysis from that angle. But now looking back, can you believe how much you had to fight to get dialysis here, though? Isn't that kind of...
Well, I could spend the entire time here. I don't know how much time we have, but I could relate all kinds of specific stories about how hard we've had to fight in the Northeast Kingdom for the kinds of services that are available, including the North Cotton Cancer Cancer Center, which is one of the first state-of-the-art cancer centers in this rural region of the country, meaning Maine, New Hampshire, upstate New York, Vermont. Um, People here, when I first came here, I told people, you're living the golden era of healthcare, but there are things that we need to do. But politically, I would say advocating for the kinds of services that people here deserve and should get, um, and they can be made affordable, believe it or not, it's been a real political fight.
Right. That's what really struck me about you through all of my hats. I've known you from afar is I could tell you were passionate, and I could also tell that you weren't a person who weren't. There's some people who are just filling their. They're there for the paycheck. I never got that feeling from you. I knew you were a strong advocate for the region.
Well, I am, but I've been a strong advocate almost for any place I've been. I mean, I grew up in an industrial city where, in fact, in my college years, I worked in the Case Manufacturing Company in Racine, Wisconsin, which is now Case International. But I know inner city stuff, and there's plenty. I worked in Harlem. I worked in Brooklyn. I worked in tough parts of Queens. I worked in the South.
Yeah,
So,
let's go up. Let's go back a little bit. Then, who are you? Where did you grow up?
well, I'm one of 8 children. Technically, I'm in the middle because my next younger brother and sister were twins. So my mother had 7 birth experiences. One was twins. So we had 8 children in our family. My father worked in the Case factory. My mom was a farm woman from northwestern Minnesota. We grew up in a regular old 25 by 25 two-story house. So basically, you had 1,300 square feet for a family of 10 people with 1 bathroom. So you'll learn about sharing. My family background, very Lutheran, very religious, evangelical Lutheran. So I was taught very early, right or wrong, money is not the issue. You know, you don't. Obviously you don't plan for poverty, but money is not the reason we're here.
Yeah, I've traveled over that way a bit, just because one of my sons he's lived in Wisconsin and Minnesota. He's since has moved back, and I did notice the Lutheran Church is very big over in that region.
Well, that's because a lot of the people in that part of the country came, as did all my grandparents, from Scandinavia. So my grandparents all came from different parts of Sweden, but there are a lot of Norwegians and Danes in the area too. So Lutheran churches have been the state churches of those countries until the recent past. So.
Then I was reading an article that really prompted me to have you come on. It was an article about you. It was written by Amy Ash Nixon of the Caledonia Record, and I liked the bit that it appears you had a transformational moment by being drafted to go to Vietnam.
Well, it's hard not to be transformational over that. Yes, at the time. Obviously, and this was 1968, 1969, 1970, a lot of unrest in the country. We talk about upset in the country, now, but I remember the Chicago riots and all of that sort of thing. I had a choice of, what's our moral stake in Southeast Asia? Why are we there in the first place? Did a lot of reading. But I also felt, I'm not leaving the country. We're all morally implicated in what the country is doing, whether we like it or not. So there were a lot of reasons. I was drafted at the time. It wasn't like, oh, I had a high number or a low number. You were just drafted. And I had a grand uncle on the AFES board at the time, and so he made sure I was one of the first recruits. But so after college, I ended up getting drafted and went to South Vietnam for a little over 3 months. And the reason it was only 3 months is, at the time, and this was 1969 at the time, the then President Nixon started to what was called Arvanizing the conflict there. And it wasn't actually the Vietnam War, it was our war over there. Very complicated, but yeah, I mean, that was transformational, but it sounds weird, but there's a lot of transformation that goes on. I mean, I was transformed when I came to the kingdom. I was transformed, in a sense. You're growing all the time.
But it sounded to me, though, like with Vietnam, and you, even though you were saying in the article that you never had to kill anybody, you saw death, and but then it sounds like what you saw in Vietnam made you be able to transform into a social worker in the city a lot easier, because you were probably able to put things underneath perspective about the dangers of the city versus the dangers of Vietnam.
Oh, yeah, no, when I came back, I was, in fact, working with the New York City Department of Social Services and Department of Health. And, it was the, basically, the typical Army field jacket at the time and the jeans and the sneakers. So I was trained in advanced infantry techniques and all of that sort of thing. So, yeah, I was working in a lot of tough neighborhoods and thinking, wow, this feels really familiar. Not necessarily in a good way, but you use the things you learned, like when you're out in a tough neighborhood, you don't do routines, and you're not supposed to do routines in the military either, where you're an easy target. But it gave me a chance to literally help a lot of people, and that's sort of what bottom line motivates me is. Things in this country, they could be a lot better than they are. And most of it's by, I mean, this is going to sound hokey and corny, but just by practicing the golden rule. And, I like the whole environment of neighbors helping neighbors and actually knowing neighbors. And you can do this in a big city as well as a rural area.
So how did you end up from Wisconsin, Vietnam, then to New York? How did you end up in rural Northeast Kingdom?
In this business, if people halfway like you and think you can do an okay job, people call you up and said, hey, would you be interested in looking at this situation or that situation? And my wife, being from New Hampshire, she grew up in Manchester.
So where did you meet her?
Actually, in a softball game at one of my hospital jobs. She was working for a company that provided laboratory reference services, and I was in my first administrative job, and I was sliding into second base, and I was out, but I decided, hey, I'm going to ask her out, and then things worked out eventually so that we got married, and we've been married for better than 35 years now.
So you were able to.
Anyway,
so
yeah.
you live relatively close to her stomping grounds in New Hampshire.
Well, we both come from very large families, so we have a lot of connections with. Over the years, they're not all alive now, but with her 9 siblings. So
you didn't have like 9, 10 kids yourself then, did you?
No, we decided to have 3 and say this probably is the best in terms of being able to support our children and all of that sort of thing.
Yeah, we hear a lot about the Northeast Kingdom losing its population, and in part it's because the young people moving away, but also we don't have the huge families. Up this way, there were a lot of huge families, especially seems to have been more amongst the French, because I spoke to one woman, she had 18 kids, and I'm thinking, boy, 18 kids. That must have been a challenge.
Well, I know it was a challenge for mothers who had 8 and 9 children because I witnessed it firsthand. But my mother was one really. I mean, she also was a school teacher. Interestingly enough,
Right.
from way up in northwestern Minnesota. And if you think the Northeast Kingdom is remote.
Right.
I used to go to my uncle's farm, and plumbing in the kitchen sink was you pumped the handle, and you used the bathroom. You either had a chamber pot for the adults, or we would go out in the woods to the outhouse. So I know that whole scene as well. But yeah, our youngest daughter, by the way, too, just by way of specific challenges, my youngest daughter was born with Down syndrome. So we have, like all families, you invest a lot of time and love in your family, and they've all done very well. If you're a professional, just like some of the people you mentioned earlier about, the people from if you call it a junk car
Yeah.
place, if they come off and, to be pediatricians and surgeons. My 2 older daughters are professionals, and they went out into the world, and they're still out in the world. But today, remarkably, you can stay in close touch with your kids, even if they're far away, with FaceTime and Snapchat and all that
Well, if you
stuff.
think about it, cartoons we grew up with, it seems like so unrealistic. Well, now it's like the Jetsons could get on a screen and talk. George and his boss could talk through this screen, and at the time when it came out, it was like, oh, that's too far fetched. Now you just pick up your phone and you can FaceTime
Right.
with your kids across the world. And so you're right, the technology.
Yeah.
So when you arrived here in the kingdom in 1986, what did you think about this region? As in, first of all, the appearance of it. What did you think about the kingdom?
Well, actually, I pictured, because I'd never been in the Northeast Kingdom before I even came up here and interviewed, I pictured 2 asphalt roads crossing in the woods with maybe then Howard Johnson's,
Right.
locally or something, with small villages
Right.
and that sort of thing. But when we first came out and interviewed, I have always loved the outdoors. I've been all over the place. So it was like just a very exciting, hey, I'm going to learn all I can about the people who live in the area. I've always been interested in neighborhoods, and to me, the whole Northeast Kingdom is the neighborhood. My ideal goal for the Northeast Kingdom would be that somehow Sheffield Height culture divider could be so that people in the northern Northeast Kingdom and the southern Northeast Kingdom could feel more united to fight for a lot of policy issues which could improve life here in the Northeast Kingdom. And if you want, I can get into all my
Right.
thinking about that.
Great.
But it was one of, hey, I want to meet all the people. I met just a lot of nice people, but and I've been around what I would call economically challenged areas, but the farm culture I understand at the gut level because I've been around a lot of that where I grew up, even though I grew up in a city.
Now, what about medically? How were we set here when you arrived in the area compared to the rest of the world? Well, not the rest of the world, the rest of the country where you.
Well, again, a lot of people don't realize, and I said this when I first got here, because I had seen a lot, and I have seen a lot around the country and around the world. You guys don't, it's hard to understand how good you really have it in many ways. Now, there were things, missing, and we talked about dialysis, and we talked about cancer care and a few other resources, but in the region, you had state-of-the-art eye care. Al Thomas and Ted Houle. They had an eye care program in the region that was known all the way down into Massachusetts. And you know how I would find out these kinds of things. I would go out exploring with some of the people, bird watchers from the Fairbanks Museum, and I would end up in a little cafe down in Alton, Massachusetts, and they'd ask, "Where are you from?" And I'd say, "St. Johnsbury." "Oh, that's where we get our eye care." I mean, it was really amazing, but what was available. But healthcare evolving so quickly, you got to be really on your toes. And I've always had this corny sort of mantra of you have to be fast, flexible, fat-free, fiduciarily fit, fun, fantastic, and whatever. But you really need to be nimble in this business. And one of the messages I keep repeating too, in one sense, is like that song, "Don't Stop Thinking About Tomorrow," because yesterday's gone. It's not like you forget what happened, but boy, in any business right now, if you're going to be competitive in the future, you really need to look at where the opportunities are, where the potholes are, and you have to listen a lot. And I'm chronically curious, so you have to ask a lot of questions, even if they make you uncomfortable, that sort of thing. But boy, there are things that really bother me. I mean, it's not like I don't get angry or frustrated, because I do, but I still see both here regionally incredible opportunities, and politically, I'm not a member of either party, by the way, but I'm not also a wussy, don't stand for anything kind of person. But one of the things that I think really could help the Northeast Kingdom and the whole eastern side of the state is if the Republicans and the Democrats could start thinking less about party, right, and think about what is it that's really going to make this side of the state hum. Because you go to any economic rankings, and I have followed tax policy and the economics of Vermont very closely for years. You got the A side of the state, which is the western side of the state, and then the C to C minus side of the state, which is the eastern side of the state, and that's not right. Even if you're a progressive, if progressives like to help poor people, the rich on the west should help the poor on the east, if you want to put it like that.
Sometimes I think, and I can say this since I was born and raised here, maybe it doesn't sound so good coming from somebody else, but I think sometimes our stubborn independence sometimes get in our way too, is especially with health, is I don't think sometimes we always get the fact is to a large degree we are in charge of our healthcare destiny, as in
that to a large degree, that if I understand you correctly, here is my thinking about that for myself. It's right. Like you can't just depend on the medical system to manage your health.
Right.
You got you or your family members, and not everybody's in a situation where they can do this, but you have to really think about how am I treating myself, right, and how am I managing my own health, and how am I advocating for my family or myself in terms of just living a healthy lifestyle. And people are probably tired of hearing me, but whenever I hear, "Oh, there's nothing to do here in the Northeast Kingdom," I say, I've been around many different places. I can't think of in many ways, a place where there's more opportunity to live a healthy lifestyle. Now, having said that, I know what logging life can be like. I know what a farming. My uncles were all farmers, right, and there's tough work, but independence is good.
Right. Yeah, and it can be really good because, but as I said, sometimes when we're on the wrong track, we don't like to veer back in the right direction.
Well,
because sometimes we can be just too stubborn.
Well, it's not only stubborn. It's hard to do that. I mean, I don't know about you, but You know, I've been a long distance runner for much of my life, and you know, compulsively, if I don't get exercise, you know, 4 or 5 times a week or something physical every single day, uh, I'm not in a good mood.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, I'm actually I consider myself in very good health for my age and that because when I served in legislature, I'm going to tell you if you want an unhealthy lifestyle, with all respects to the people who serve there, that's an unhealthy lifestyle because all you're doing is sitting all the time, and the lobbyists are always trying to give you food. They're trying to give you booze, and I see a lot of people. They fall to pieces when they serve in legislature, and I was one of them. So I got out of legislature and got health back again. Um, so, do you find that the people are that much different here than other places you've been, or are we all pretty much the same? Or
Well, there's always, just like our DNA makeup, there people are more the same
right,
than different. I don't care where you go. I mean,
right,
people are, you know, interested a lot of times about family. There are what I would describe as tribal differences that, you know, really sort of connect with that Robert Frost, something in us loves a wall, you know. Uh, there's there could be more. Well, you mentioned independence. There probably could be more cooperation, but in general, people here are. And Darcy McCann mentioned this in the Caledonian Record recently when she was at the Big Eve thing for business in, I think it was Massachusetts. But she was saying people generally that come, the thousands of people that came by the Northeast Kingdom Chamber display expressed great positive feelings about the Northeast Kingdom. People are so welcoming, so friendly. For the most part, that's true. But the other flip side of that is if you know, look at some of the studies that have been done in Vermont, the section or Department of Rural Studies, I believe it was at UVM, occasionally does a Vermont happiness study. I don't know if you're aware of that,
no,
but Caledonia County in the 2013 study was Caledonia County and some of the Northeast Kingdom. That's where some of the Vermont's unhappiest people are.
really,
Well, in terms of their self-rating, and I don't, you know how scientific the survey process is, but I was quite taken aback by seeing that. But then thinking about it, you know, you got a lot of well-educated people who are, in my opinion, underemployed, and that, you know,
what, and
yeah,
that's the problem here is
and that's a challenge, yeah.
at this chapter in our history, I personally cannot think of a time when there's been more jobs in our region, but they're not, they're more or less the base level jobs. There really aren't, there's not a lot of mobility for people who are in that either mid level or upper level. If you have a job, one of those jobs, you better be sticking in it because there just doesn't seem to be a lot of professional level jobs here.
Well, I think that some of the leaders in this area are trying to do something about that broadly, both for the industries that are here, and I know NVDA and NCIC are working with all kinds of leaders from the business and education sector to make sure that people have the opportunity to learn enough to be all they can be, so to speak. Uh, I will focus on, again, what the Northeastern Vermont Regional Hospital has done. I mean, you know, looking at this stuff back in the 1990s, again, talking about don't stop thinking about tomorrow. I was thinking 15, 20 years out. Here's what's going to be happening in the healthcare sector, and you gotta start supporting. And we've funded this. You have to start supporting and then succeeding with professional development programs. So in terms of a track record of keeping youth here, there are many women who have gone from, in some cases, public assistance to being the major breadwinners in their family, because we worked with Carol Moore and Linden State College in the hospital, and eventually the Vermont Technical Center to set up the nurses program. And talk about fighting. We had Veronica Haychuk, Carol Moore, and I. We had to fight for that. We had to fight with the some of the state college leaders on this. What I call, some of the professors and stuff like this. And UVM itself was resistant at first, but we, with working against a lot of headwinds, and it took some money. The hospital basically has funded these programs to the tune of $100,000 a year, so it's not like some small chump change kind of effort, but we've graduated well over 100 people, and employment success, and these are mostly younger people, almost all younger people, with almost 100% employment success. I mean, I would say, okay, try to match that anywhere else in the kingdom. I think it's possible to do that, but again, investing in the future takes a little bit of guts too, because it's money, and then you have to fight for the money.
You know what I found when I served in legislature is, for a few years, and I was on the healthcare committee, is there's a real disconnect between, I hate this us and them mentality, but it really does exist, is the mentality of the urban Vermont, which is not that urban.
It isn't.
And
Believe me.
Rural Vermont, there's a disconnect. A lot of times they don't, Chittenden County, the legislators, who are very fine people, they don't understand the needs of Chittenden County are sometimes vastly different than the needs of rural Vermont, whether it be rural Northeast Kingdom or the other rural regions.
That still goes on.
Right, and like
it's as alive as ever.
Right, transportation, even transportation to get to doctor's appointments. You lose your license up here, either, legally lose your license through breaking the law, or through age. You can't drive. Getting to doctor's appointments, getting anywhere, that's how come I believe, if I understand right, we also have a higher rate than average of people driving without a license, because, I'm not condoning it, but, it's hard to get anywhere without a vehicle.
All you have to do is read the court news and you see that.
Right. So there is a real...
But what's positive about the positive opportunity is that at least eight lead agencies have come together to form an accountable health community, and ideally at some point in the future it should involve all of the lead organizations in the Northeast Kingdom, but it's called Northeast Kingdom Prosper right now, and that is it's a formal group. We're not formally we have an LLC that we've just formed for purposes of improvement in the future, but the idea is to have the physical health sector the leader, meaning northern counties and the hospitals, that sort of thing. So the physical health care piece, again, the primary health care piece, the mental health care piece, the housing piece, and the food security piece, and then the financial security piece, all working with aligned strategies so that you can actually measure and lift all boats, so to speak, in the Northeast Kingdom. And there are a lot of positive things that are happening, and just having this dialogue with you, one of the follow-up things I'll do is have people be in touch with you, because this word needs to get out to everybody.
Yeah, because I welcome people on. I have a whole array of people, because even because I served on the healthcare committee, I'm still fascinated by healthcare policy, and and I'm going to tell you, you'll probably agree with me on this. You cannot understand healthcare policy by listening to a soundbite on somebody on the news. It's so
Oh, it drives me crazy. I grew up, by the way, without a TV, so I have a hard time sitting down and even watching a TV.
Right,
But
and it's
these
so
sound bites are crazy.
yeah, and that's what people go by is nothing is as simple as those sound bites. And politicians
Right.
really, no matter what party, they know the lingo. They just talk in sound bites. But if you really question them, if you go beyond those sound bites, you find out very quickly who really knows what they're talking about and who are just talking in sound
You are
bites.
absolutely right. And it's pretty easy. All you have to do is ask a couple probing questions.
Right, because that's the way it all. Hey, here's a topic that one of my pet peeves about the healthcare system today, and I know things have
I
had to
probably
change.
could imagine it.
Is I know this is the one I know it had to change. I hate doctors now being employed by hospitals. I like the day where the doctors were independent, the primary care doctors, and but I understand the reason for the change. But I still go to a doctor who's one of the few. I went once. My doctor, my other doctor retired. He was an independent doctor. And then my doctor now is independent, but I'm running out of independent doctors. I understand the pros and the cons of the consolidation just to reduce costs. But what do you think
No,
about it?
it's not just to reduce cost. The economic viability for independent physicians is approaching its limit, which is about
that's
zero.
that's kind of what I meant too.
Yeah.
Wrapped into one is
Yeah.
it's hard for these primary, and you know what, primary care doctors, they're not. I hate to say it, people don't always get them the respect they deserve because they're really on the front lines of bending the curve of
They
the health.
can be. That's
Right.
true.
And that's how come primary care doctors are very important.
Well, and then things are broadening too. So you have primary care physicians of different sorts with different sets of skills, but generally, yes, they're primary care medical people who help people manage their own health. So, but in addition to those people, there are, and those are MDs. Now we're finding out more DOs, doctors of osteopathy, that come out of the osteopathic institutions. And then you have nurse practitioners that are now starting to graduate out of special programs and able to practice largely independently. But if you're really going to get a job done, you have to have all of the clinicians working as a team. And then you have physician assistants who are a very important component in the healthcare service continuum, if you want to describe it that way. So nowadays, first of all, with independent physicians, I worked with a lot of independent physicians. I worked with a lot of employed physicians. As long as you have people aligned and working to support, improvements in the population health, it doesn't make any difference to me. The thing about it, though, is if the hospital if we had not employed physicians, you just wouldn't have the physicians here.
That's why
they just wouldn't be here.
Yeah, and that's why I say I totally understand. It's just one of my things. I guess I'm getting old when I think back. Oh, back when I was a kid. But you know what? In reality, I tell people this all the time. People talk about the good old days. Oh, you mean like the good old days when you stepped on a nail? You're probably going to die. This is before our time, but our parents' times. If you stepped on a nail, that might be a death sentence. Today, step on a nail, not a good thing, but a tetanus shot's going to take care of it.
I did step on a nail once in a barn and didn't get a tetanus shot, but I'm still here. But
yeah,
I know I know exactly what you mean, and boy, it hurts to step on a nail.
Now, do you struggle? Does NVRH struggle to keep fully staffed, or do they have a steady supply of people who want
You
to move
always, you always have to struggle, hopefully ahead of any developing problems, to make sure you have sufficient staff. And then with changes in healthcare, people want the number of people going to emergency rooms for urgent or non-urgent problems that could perhaps go into practice. That that emergency room population is actually increasing. We're finding much more pressure, particularly these days. The most chaotic system is the mental health system. Like it or not, we now we provide care to and have to keep people in the hospital who previously would go to the state hospital, but many of the institutions previously, when the state hospital existed in Waterbury, the hospital couldn't say no if we had to transfer a high security person. Now they can. And so we'll end up having to manage people for 2 weeks who, in my opinion, are very dangerous. And I could go off on a big tangent about how this is creating huge increases in healthcare costs, because the regulatory bodies require this, that, and the other thing, which don't necessarily produce revenue, but they produce a lot of costs. So I would say in managing that population alone now, we're expending well over $500,000 a year for no offsetting revenue. And that's not a wild statement.
And from what I understand is, while I'm sure you get your staff an adequate training, the healthcare people probably to a degree are not really trained in some of the issues they face from these people who are
you would be surprised at how well trained many of the people really are. And the key thing is, if you have somebody new coming into the hospital, you have to do orientation in very different manners from the good old days, so to speak. But yeah, no, that's a challenge. I mean, you have somebody who comes out of an institution and starts, from away, ends up in our area and starts threatening all kinds of people. The police authorities drop them off at our emergency room door, and it's our riddle to answer. And so you'd be amazed at how trained people are in terms of de-escalating procedures. However, many of the rules are that apply to caring for people with psychiatric challenges. There are rules that apply that make it difficult to communicate across organizations, coordinate care, understand the final outcome of what happened with all of the very costly inputs and efforts to help. But also there are rules such that if you don't do things in order, like for example restraints, who can be held in restraints, who can take medication, who can be forced to take medications, who can be touched, who cannot, who can you not touch under what circumstances. That stuff is sort of morphing all the time, and so we're dealing with complexities, regulatory complexities that previously were just something that weren't part of our daily life.
Right. Well, we can't really talk about healthcare without talking about the opiate crisis too. Like that was probably an issue that I don't know if you ever pictured this happening back in the 80s.
Yes.
But so what's your perspective on the opiate crisis?
Well, first of all, you have to figure out why. First of all, when I came here, there was a Founders Hall program, and we tried to broaden that program, but the state of Vermont said basically outpatient services are just as effective as inpatient services, so we're no longer going to pay for inpatient services. So basically I closed down the Founders Hall program and one day laid off 50 people, which is not a fun thing to do, but if if you sit there and say, oh, we're going to keep on doing this, eventually, you lose the whole everything, not just that program. So, but I basically at that time, and this was the early 1990s, I told the policymakers who have long since retired, who worked on the healthcare resource allocation plan, which is something that still exists, by the way, although it's not given very much public attention. But the point is, I said at the time, this is going to come back to haunt us. Because, well, I was threatened by Howard Dean once because one of our physicians, who ended up being a well-known addictions board-certified specialist out in Colorado. That guy did a lot for Colorado because Vermont really didn't welcome him. Here's a guy who was threatened by Howard Dean because there was a question about the value of using medication-assisted treatment for opiate-addicted people. At the time, the opiate of choice at that time was heroin. People told me that, this heroin crisis was new back in the late 80s and the early 90s, and I said, no, from what I'm looking at, this has been a problem ever since 93 hooked up with 91, hooked up with Montreal,
sure.
and you name it. This is not like something new. In fact, I knew of cases where drug traffickers were trying to buy property from John Elliott at the time. I don't know if you remember him, but John Elliott, a primary physician from Danville.
Sure.
Somebody wanted to buy cash on the barrelhead for some of his property, and they basically were just looking for a landing strip so that they could bring in, smuggle drugs through the area. But anyway, it's not like I'm prescient and saw things coming, but when it comes to drug treatment centers, I had seen a lot in other parts of the country. In inner city New York, which for drug trafficking purposes was like drug addiction central. I basically said this is going to come back to haunt us, and it did.
Sure did.
But that said, there are a lot of other influences that have come into the area. And first of all of both rural and urban America, wherever there are pockets of poverty and wealth, by the way, you're going to have a drug problem. I can remember seeing. I was really shocked once. I was invited to a party where I saw professionals snorting cocaine. I had never seen that before. I was like, holy.
Oh, sure.
What am I seeing? These are people who could have good sense. Do they know what they're doing? They're creating a demand for these cartels in other countries and misery like you wouldn't believe, but oh no, they're just enjoying a high,
I've had a number of recovering heroin users on this show, and they will say, and they're very honest about it, back in the good old days, they used to be able to go to the doctors and get fixed up with whatever they need by faking something, whatever. And they said that's pretty much, those days are pretty much done because of new regulations and new policies.
They are, but we had put in systems in place too. We can track who's doing what.
Right, but yeah, so...
But to your point, this is interesting because, again, I had studied enough statistics, and I did a research project of my own back in 1978, 79 in southern Maine, looking at, I basically studied, what would you call it, Schedule 2 based prescription habits of different practitioners in an ER. And the data I collected at the time showed a pattern where there was one physician who had a pattern of prescribing more, and that person ended up losing his DEA license and his license to practice because there are ways of discovering who's doing what and how to improve. But a lot of medicine was, I think, misled back in the, I would put it like this, the early 2000s, because I can remember going to seminars where people who were, in fact, affiliated with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services in the Department of Health and Social Services out of Baltimore and D.C., who were telling people at the time, if you're not managing pain properly, you're going to get dinged. And then the pharmaceutical companies were doing their thing with all kinds of sophisticated communication that gave people cover to and reason to prescribe more than necessary. So
Right. And
anyway.
Yeah, that's what I know that history, and I agree. So now it's, now we're having to work on the fallout. Okay, we only have a few more minutes left. I once made a comment to you. Are you the longest serving CEO that has ever of a hospital that has ever existed in Vermont?
I don't know.
Is because CEOs, for the most part, of any place, they typically, you don't hear of one that lasts 30-something years.
You have to have a certain focus, and I could have gone on to, if you want to look at it that way, I could have worked in larger organizations, larger hospitals, but in terms of the whole experience, the life experience, I like a broader connection with people, the community. I don't like to be, and I could have done this in New York City or a number of other places where you have your own identified parking slot, and you walk into the big facility, and you're looking at things from not only 30,000 feet, but maybe 50,000 feet. And then you can drive away pretty much anonymously unless you do something very egregious.
Right.
Here, as Rich Beck told me back when I first came, he worked for the Caledonian Record. I don't know if you know him, but I was walking down the street shortly after I got here, and he was interviewing me walking down the sidewalk, or we were just chatting, and he said, well, Paul, people love their hospital, but they watch their CEO like a hawk. Okay. So I like the fact that you cannot be anonymous. I mean, you cannot allow, and people benefit from this. If there's something that's not right that happens, I hear about it, even if it's not quite true, what I'm hearing, but you also have the obligation to follow up, and if things need to be made better, make things better. If you're not paying attention, things can get worse really quickly.
So what now for Paul Bengtson, who will no longer have the title as CEO? What do you plan to do with yourself?
I remember life before I was a CEO, and life.
Are you staying here?
That's the plan, at least for the time being. I mean, I'm not one. It's not like I dislike Florida, but I have no interest in moving to the Gulf Coast, or certainly not to Magic Beach or whatever it is in the panhandle of Florida right now. But we have relatives in the area. We'll see. The biggest challenge actually is going to be finding what in our family, my wife and I consider safe independence for our youngest daughter, who knows just about everybody in the Northeast Kingdom, and we're going to be looking for what's the best future for her.
Yeah, knowing that you're.
And then I got 1,000 other interests. I just have to watch that I don't run after too many of those interests.
Right. Now Sean Tester is going to be the new CEO, and I understand he has some Northeast Kingdom roots.
Well, he does. Even though apparently he was born in either Connecticut or Massachusetts, he moved up here early in his life and lives in the Lyndonville area and has a long working relationship with health providers, both in the North Country of New Hampshire and here in the Northeast Kingdom. So, you know, there are a lot of people who know him, and there's a certain real benefit to that. So.
You know, I've been told though, he has some mighty. I was talking to some of your not your constituents, but some of the folks down your way when I'm down here, and I have been told by a couple people he has mighty big shoes to fill when you leave, because you have become such a important part of not only the hospital community but the general community as a whole. And so now he's going to go in there with his ideas and what advice do you have for him?
Well, just listen to everybody else's ideas, because you know, I may have some ideas and he may have some ideas, but there are probably 5,000 other people who have all different kinds of ideas, and you sort of have to, you know, listen to all of those ideas and apply the best ones that that seem to have promised to do the most or provide the most benefit.
Right.
But
Okay.
you know, the thing is, you know, he listens to. I mean, I've seen him. He listens to people.
I'll have to get
He's
him on.
nice.
I'll have to get him on the show too.
His family's nice. They're in the community, and so I think that this bodes well.
Okay, a minute. What do you want to say about the people you've worked with, about the community that has, you know, you've worked with? Final words.
Well, yeah, it's not like my last will and testament, but it's well, I say what I've always said. Just again, make sure we can all get along. I love the people we work with. You know, you can have really intensely negative interactions with people, and the same people in another venue. You can have intensely positive working relationships with them. The thing is, anybody's got to watch it. Don't hold grudges against people. You know, and you focus on where you want to go. Not, in other words, what's the final goal? You don't focus on somebody, and I've been told this any number of times, how stupid I am. But you know, you don't. You know, I know that anyway. It's like I'm not going to get in an argument about that. It's that's not, you know, that's not the focus of the conversation. Where you want to go. So you got a lot of talented people. I encourage leadership and the board to let people run with their talent. And
I want to thank you, well, not only for coming on the show, but thank you for, you know, all you've done for the hospital, but also for our little corner of the world, the Northeast Kingdom. And I wish you well in this next endeavor.
Yeah. No, I feel like things are, well, I mean, I'm looking forward to the rest of life like I looked forward to this life that I've been living. So.
Okay,
yeah.
Well, thank you for coming on.
And I don't even think this is I don't even like to emphasize this is a little corner of the world. All corners of the world are little when you really get down to it. Even the Oval Office.
Yeah, that's true. Okay,
right.
Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it, yeah.
And thank you to the viewers for tuning in to another segment of the Northeast Kingdom Voice.